The air before dawn carries a kind of weight that feels different from night. It isn't fully darkness anymore, but it isn't morning either. It's a colorless in-between, where everything loses its edges and the forest becomes a place without time. I learned this while walking through the pines at the far edge of my family's property, an old stretch of land where the soil smelled of iron and damp moss, and where the ground softened beneath your steps like a sponge holding the night's cold breath. I had been awake since 3. Sleep had slipped from me like a thin sheet torn by restless hands. No reason, no nightmare, just the quiet insistence of my body pulling me from bed. The house was too warm, the walls too close, and I needed the outside. I grabbed a jacket and stepped onto the back porch, where the boards still held the chill of the earth. The sky above was a deep slate, thinning toward a pale silver on the horizon. Not sunrise yet, not even close. Only that strange pre-light that makes the world look washed and hollow. The path behind the house led into the pines. I knew it by heart. Years of wandering those woods had carved a map into my feet. I could walk it blind, guided by the soft rise of the ground and the faint crunch of last autumn's needles. Each step released the smell of resin and damp earth, sharp and sweet, the kind of scent that clings to your skin long after you've left. The trees stood like black pillars, their trunks slick with dew. Every few feet, a branch would groan under the weight of moisture, a sound so small it felt amplified in the quiet. I remember thinking how alive silence can be, how it carries every creak, every sigh of the wind as though the forest itself is breathing. As I moved deeper, the world behind me faded until the house was no more than a memory. There was only the soft murmur of pine needles falling, the distant hoot of an unseen owl, and the faint metallic taste of cold air. My breath came out in clouds that drifted upward like smoke, dissolving into the thinning dark. The ground here dipped slightly, forming a shallow basin where fog liked to gather. I had seen it before, thin, silver sheets of mist that lay low, hugging the roots like ghosts that never fully rose. It was in that basin that I first sensed something ahead. Not a sound at first, just a shift, a break in the pattern of trees. I slowed, my boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. The pines usually formed endless lines, their trunks evenly spaced like soldiers. But ahead, between 2 of the thicker trees, something interrupted that rhythm. A shape darker than the dark around it, upright, still, almost perfectly still. At first, I thought it was just a tree grown at an odd angle, maybe a split trunk. My eyes struggled to separate shadow from shadow. The first light of morning was trying to seep in, a faint bruised blue that only made edges harder to read. I took a step closer. The shape did not shift. Another step. My breath made a small cloud, drifting forward, touching nothing. It was a figure, not an animal, not a trick of the trees. A person, standing between the pines. The realization hit in a slow, creeping wave, starting in the stomach and rising like cold water up the spine. There were no details, no face, no clothing I could clearly see. Only the unmistakable outline of a human form. Shoulders, head, arms hanging loosely at the sides, perfectly motionless. The forest around me tightened. The air grew heavy, as if the fog itself thickened to press against my chest. I could hear my own heartbeat, a deep, wet drum in my ears. I tried to tell myself it was nothing more than another early riser, a hunter, a hiker, someone who had wandered in from a nearby trail. But there were no trails out here. Our property stretched for miles before meeting the next fence line. And no one came here at this hour. I stopped moving. My boots sank slightly into the damp soil, the sound loud in the fragile quiet. The figure didn't react. Not a twitch. Not a breath I could see. Just standing there, framed by the narrowing trunks like a painting that had been waiting for me to find it. The light shifted slightly. A smear of pale silver broke across the horizon, brushing the tops of the trees. It revealed just enough to show that the figure was dressed in something dark, clothing that swallowed what little light touched it. No reflection, no texture, a silhouette cut from the fabric of night. I strained to see a face, but there was nothing. The head was tilted slightly downward, as if looking not at me but at the ground between us. I don't know how long I stood there. Time bent strangely, stretching thin until each heartbeat felt like a minute. I tried to listen, to hear anything beyond my own blood rushing in my ears. But the forest had gone perfectly still. No wind, no owl, no soft patter of needles falling. Just the sound of my breath, uneven and shallow, and the weight of that figure's presence pressing against the edges of my mind. Then movement, not from the figure, from the trees around it, a faint rustle, like something sliding along the bark. My eyes darted to the left, then right, searching for the source, but there was nothing. Only the pines, their trunks slick and glistening in the dim light. When I looked back, the figure was closer. Not by much. Maybe a foot. Maybe two. But closer. I hadn't seen it move. My body reacted before my mind did. I stepped back, the sound of my heels sinking into mud cracking the silence like a gunshot. My breath quickened. The figure remained still, but now I could sense something in the space between us. A coldness that reached across the basin like a drawn-out exhale. My lungs tightened. The smell of pine sap sharpened, mixing with something metallic, something like rust. I wanted to run, but my legs felt anchored. The forest around me blurred, the trees bending slightly as if leaning in. The figure seemed taller now, though I knew that was impossible. It was as if the shadows themselves were stretching upward, feeding it. Another faint shift of light. A single ray of pale morning sun slipped through the canopy, striking the ground between us. The fog swirled briefly, catching in the beam. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw a face within the shadow, a hollow suggestion of eyes, too deep and too dark, staring straight through me. It wasn't a face made of features. It was absence, a void shaped like something that once knew how to look. The spell broke with a sound I can only describe as a sigh carried by the earth itself. A low, drawn-out exhalation that trembled through the ground and into my feet. I turned and ran. Branches whipped against my arms. The path I knew by heart suddenly felt foreign, each curve sharper, each root higher than I remembered. The forest was no longer silent. It roared with the sound of my own panic, the thud of boots on wet soil, the crack of breaking twigs, the rush of blood in my ears. Behind me, I heard nothing. No pursuit. No footsteps. Just the heavy silence folding back into place. The house appeared like a pale ghost through the thinning trees, its outline trembling in the dim light. I burst through the back porch and slammed the door behind me, my breath tearing from my lungs in ragged gasps. Inside, the world smelled of warm wood and faint smoke from the fireplace. Normal. Safe. But the silence pressed against the windows like a living thing. I stayed there until the sun rose fully, painting the woods in soft gold. From the kitchen window, I could see the path leading back into the pines. It looked harmless, peaceful, empty, but even as daylight washed over the trees, I could still feel that presence standing between them. Waiting, not gone, just hidden by the light. I never went back to that basin again. Even now, years later, when morning edges into that strange half-light and the pines stand black against the sky, I can smell the cold resin and feel the weight of those unseen eyes. Somewhere in those woods, between the trunks where fog gathers and shadows never fully leave, the figure still waits. Silent, patient, and always standing. The first sign of him was not a figure, not even a shadow, just the sound of damp earth giving beneath something heavier than the wind. I had been walking for nearly an hour, following a narrow trail that threaded through the wetlands behind my cousin's property. Morning was only beginning to break. A thin, colorless fog clung to the cattails and low shrubs like the memory of a dream that refused to fade. The air smelled of cold mud and old water, metallic and faintly sour, the way pond scum smells when it starts to dry. Every exhale turned into a brief cloud that vanished before I could even see where it went. The silence out there was the kind that feels intentional, like the world itself was holding its breath. My boots made small sucking noises in the saturated ground, each step punctuating the absence of birdsong. Even the insects seemed to have agreed to stay hidden. The only movement was the mist drifting over the reeds, slow and weightless, curling around the dark skeletons of last season's plants. I remember thinking how the fog seemed to know exactly where to go, how it gathered in pockets and crevices as though guided by something unseen. It was at the edge of that shifting gray curtain that I noticed the shape. At first it looked like a tree stump, tall and oddly narrow, a darker smudge in the pale light. I blinked, expecting it to disappear like a trick of half-awake eyes, but it stayed. The more I stared, the more it defined itself, a vertical presence, taller than me, motionless. The hood was the detail that came next, the way the upper part of the shape tapered inward as if fabric hung from a bowed head. The figure stood just where the fog grew thickest, right where the trail bent toward a stretch of dead birches. I stopped walking without realizing it. The air around me cooled sharply, enough that my fingertips began to ache. My breath seemed louder, rougher, almost intrusive. I waited for the shape to shift, for a gust of wind to pull the fog apart and reveal a branch or a broken fence post. Nothing moved. The hooded silhouette remained as still as a statue, perfectly upright, its outline sharpened by the faint light rising behind it. The morning continued to brighten, but in a way that made everything worse. Instead of sunlight cutting through the fog, the sky became a dull, lifeless silver. The world flattened. Shadows no longer behaved like shadows. They pooled thickly where they should have thinned. The reeds swayed slightly, though no breeze touched my face. The smell of wet earth grew heavier, almost sweet, as if something beneath the soil had started to rot. I told myself to turn back, to simply follow the trail home. My legs resisted, stiff with the kind of tension that feels like electricity just under the skin. I couldn't shake the thought that turning my back on the figure would be a mistake. I shifted my weight, testing the ground, and the mud released a soft, wet pop. That single sound, small, innocent, broke the perfect stillness. The hooded man responded. It was not a movement I could easily name. He didn't step forward. He didn't tilt his head. He simply straightened, as if an invisible string had been pulled taut inside him. The change was subtle but undeniable. The edges of the hood sharpened against the fog, and for an instant I sensed an impossible depth beneath it, a darkness that swallowed the weak morning light. I felt it look at me, not see look. The difference was immediate and crushing, like the way you feel when a predator notices you in the woods. The air pressed against my skin, dense and wet, like the inside of a damp cloth. My ears filled with a low rushing sound, though no wind moved. The reeds around me began to tremble, not from any breeze but in small synchronized shivers, as if the ground itself vibrated. I wanted to call out, to ask a question I didn't have words for, but my throat locked. My heartbeat became the only sound I could claim as my own, a frantic knocking against bone. The hooded figure remained at the edge of the fog, patient, waiting. The trail between us stretched no more than 20 feet, but it felt like a mile of thin ice. The texture of the moment was unbearable. Mud sucking at my boots, the damp air coating my tongue with the taste of iron, the faint echo of water dripping from somewhere unseen. My thoughts scattered like startled birds. I tried to reason. Maybe it was a hunter, a neighbor, someone lost in the wetlands before sunrise. Yet nothing about the figure belonged to the living. The hood hung too perfectly, without the small irregularities of fabric moved by breath or breeze. The outline was too sharp for fog, yet too blurred for flesh. I sensed no curiosity, no confusion, only intent, pure and singular. When I finally forced myself to take a step back, the reeds nearest the figure bowed as if pushed from behind. Not forward, not toward me, but outward, making a narrow path into the fog. The sound was faint but unmistakable, wet grass bending, water sucking beneath something heavy. The figure remained perfectly still while the path opened beside it, a corridor of mist and shadow leading deeper into the marsh. I do not remember turning. I only remember the sudden burn in my thighs as I began to run. Each step landed with a wet slap, mud splashing up to my knees. The fog thickened behind me, swallowing the trail, muffling the frantic rhythm of my retreat. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. My lungs ached with the taste of cold metal and rotting leaves. The air smelled darker the faster I moved, like the inside of an abandoned well. By the time I reached the gravel road near my cousin's fence, the sun had finally begun to push through the clouds. The fog behind me thinned just enough to reveal the trail. It was empty. No figure. No sign of a path forced through the reeds. Only the slow drip of water from the branches above, steady and indifferent. I stood there until the sound of morning birds returned, tentative and scattered. Their calls felt foreign, almost wrong, like voices trying to convince me of something I hadn't witnessed. My clothes clung to my skin with cold mud. my boots heavy with swamp water. I waited for the relief of daylight to bring explanation, but none came. The fog retreated inch by inch, leaving nothing but wet ground and the memory of a hooded man who should not have been there. Even now, when I wake before dawn and the world outside my window is drowned in gray, I think of that figure, patient, silent, waiting at the edge of the morning fog. I tell myself it was a trick of light, a shadow sculpted by mist. But every time I close my eyes, I see the reeds bowing to an unseen presence, opening a path that led somewhere I will never follow. And I know, as surely as I know the sound of my own heartbeat, that if I ever return to that trail before sunrise, he will still be there, waiting. The morning began with a damp stillness that clung to every inch of the forest. It wasn't foggy, not exactly, but the air carried a softness that muted everything, like a heavy blanket of moisture pressing down on the world. The trail ahead shimmered with a slick sheen of dew, each blade of grass bending under tiny drops of water that trembled but refused to fall. I remember noticing how the ground gave slightly beneath my boots, a spongy cushion of soil still swollen from the night's cold breath. I had started my hike earlier than usual, long before the sun fully rose. The plan was simple: follow the narrow trail through the woods, loop around the small lake, and reach the overlook before the morning crowd arrived. I wanted the solitude, the quiet, the sound of my own heartbeat echoing in a place where human voices didn't belong. But even then, even in those first steps, there was something different about that morning, something I didn't yet understand. The forest smelled of wet bark and earth, rich, sharp, almost metallic in the cold air. The dampness brought out every detail: the faint sweetness of moss, the sour rot of decaying leaves hidden beneath layers of pine needles, the subtle mineral tang of water seeping up from underground. My breath came out in faint, silvery puffs, hanging in the dim half-light before dissolving into nothing. Each step crunched softly against the pebbled path, a rhythm that seemed too loud in the muffled world around me. For a while it was perfect. The quiet was complete, broken only by the occasional chirp of a bird testing the morning, or the distant crack of a branch surrendering to its own weight. But as I rounded a slight bend in the trail, a place where the trees thickened and the air grew even cooler, I felt it. A prickle along the back of my neck, a slow tightening in my chest. It wasn't sound at first. It was awareness. The kind that crawls in from nowhere and whispers that you are no longer alone. I stopped and listened. The silence held. No wind. No birds. Not even the low hum of insects. Just the faint, almost imperceptible dripping of water from somewhere deep in the undergrowth. I told myself it was nothing. Just nerves, the byproduct of being alone in a place where the mind could invent shapes and shadows. I kept walking, a little faster this time, my boots leaving dark, wet imprints on the dew-covered trail. Then it came. A sound. Soft. Measured. Behind me. It wasn't the sharp snap of a twig or the accidental skid of a shoe on gravel. It was quieter, more deliberate. A faint crunch of damp earth, perfectly timed to the rhythm of my own steps, but just a fraction behind, like an echo with weight. I froze. The sound stopped too. I turned slowly, scanning the trail I had just walked. The path curved gently backward, framed by tall pines that reached toward the pale, waking sky. Nothing moved. No flash of a deer's tail, no hiker emerging from the dimness. Only the trees, standing motionless, dripping with morning moisture. I waited longer than I cared to admit, standing there with my breath caught somewhere between my throat and chest. Eventually, I forced myself to move again. One step, 2, 3. The sound followed, faint, careful, and undeniably human. The sensation of being watched settled into me like a slow injection of ice. Each nerve along my spine lit up in sequence, and every instinct I had screamed to leave the trail, to run, to vanish into the thicker parts of the forest. But reason, cold and stubborn, kept me moving forward. Running would only feed panic. If it was another hiker, if it was someone harmless, running would only make me look insane. The trail narrowed ahead, threading through a corridor of closely packed trees. The air grew wetter, colder, until the dew on the leaves became a fine mist against my skin. I could smell the water before I heard it, a stagnant pool hidden off the path, where the ground dipped and collected the night's condensation. My boots sank slightly into the mud with each step. And still, behind me, the stranger followed. I dared a glance over my shoulder. At first, nothing, then a shape. Far down the trail, half obscured by the dark trunks of the trees, stood a figure. Tall, unmoving, its outline blurred by distance and the dim light. I couldn't see a face. I couldn't even be sure of its clothing, only that it was dark and human and standing perfectly still, like it had been waiting for me to look. I whipped my head forward and kept walking, forcing my pace to remain steady even as my heart began to slam against my ribs. The trail's moisture clung to everything now, beating on my eyelashes, slicking my palms. Each breath tasted like wet stone and pine sap, thick and bitter. My mind clawed for logic, maybe another early hiker, someone just as startled by my presence as I was by theirs. But logic faltered when I realized how silent the forest remained, how every bird and insect seemed to have disappeared into the damp earth. The next stretch of trail twisted sharply around an outcrop of rock, the kind that forces you to lose sight of what's behind you. I took the turn faster than I should have, my boot slipping slightly on a slick patch of moss. For a moment, I thought about leaving the path entirely, cutting through the trees to reach the main road. But the woods beyond the trail were dense and treacherous, littered with hidden roots and dark pockets of stagnant water. I stayed on the path, telling myself it was safer, even as my instincts screamed otherwise. The sound of footsteps returned, closer now, no longer faint, no longer cautious, a slow, deliberate crunch of wet gravel that matched my own pace exactly. Every step I took, it took. Every pause, it paused. I quickened, the cold air burning against my lungs, the damp smell of moss filling every breath. The trees began to thin slightly ahead, promising an opening, a break in the oppressive dark. But with that faint light came a deeper dread. I could feel it behind me, not just the sound, but a presence. Heavy, unyielding, like the trail itself had grown eyes. I risked another glance. The figure was closer, still distant, but no longer blurred. I could make out a shape draped in something dark and heavy, clothing that absorbed the faint morning light instead of reflecting it. The head was slightly tilted, as if studying me, but no features were visible. Just a blackness where a face should have been. I turned forward and kept moving, my steps now a near jog. The trail opened slightly, revealing the faint shimmer of the lake through the trees. If I could reach it, maybe I could find another hiker, a fisherman, anyone. But the lake was still far, and the stranger's footsteps grew louder with each passing second. I don't remember deciding to run. One moment I was walking, the next my boots were pounding against the dew-slick path, each step sending up tiny sprays of water. The air tore at my throat, cold and sharp, but I didn't care. Behind me, the footsteps matched mine perfectly, fast, relentless, closing the distance. Branches whipped against my arms, scratching thin, wet lines into my skin. The ground blurred beneath me in shades of gray and green. My lungs screamed, but I didn't stop until I reached a sudden break in the trail, a fork where the path split into two narrow routes. For a split second, I hesitated. Left led toward the lake. Right twisted back toward the parking lot. Both looked equally dark, equally endless. I chose right. The moment my foot hit the new path, the sound behind me stopped. Silence, complete and absolute. I stumbled to a halt, chest heaving, ears straining for the slightest crunch of earth. Nothing. No footsteps. No breathing. No figure emerging from the shadows. I stayed there for what felt like hours, the damp air clinging to my clothes, my heart pounding so hard it seemed to shake the trees themselves. Finally, with trembling legs, I started forward again. The parking lot was only a mile away. Every step felt heavier than the last. When I finally emerged from the trail, the sun had fully risen, spilling pale gold across the empty gravel. My car sat alone, slick with dew. No other vehicles. No sign of another hiker. I drove away without looking back. But even now, days later, I can still feel it. The weight of those footsteps behind me, the silent figure in the damp morning air. And sometimes, when I walk across wet grass or hear the soft crunch of soil underfoot, I swear I can hear it again. Matching me, waiting. The night was loosening its grip when I left the narrow dirt path and wandered toward the clearing. A wet hush clung to the forest like a secret, and each breath I took tasted of soil soaked by dew. The air carried the cold sting of a world that had not yet decided whether to wake. My boots pressed into damp earth with soft, deliberate sounds, muffled as though the forest itself preferred silence over conversation. A faint blue haze pooled low among the trunks, gathering in dips between roots where water collected during the night. Thin threads of fog drifted across my path, sliding over fallen branches like restless phantoms. I could smell the sharp resin of pine mingling with the faint sweetness of rotting leaves, a fragrance that felt both alive and ancient. Every detail stood out with unnatural clarity. The slick glimmer of moss clinging to bark, the faint crackle of frost retreating from the edges of stones, the distant drip of water as it fell from the tips of stubborn needles. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a bird stirred and gave a single questioning note, a fragile sound swallowed almost immediately by the heavy quiet. I paused, letting the chill bite into my fingertips, listening to the stillness settle again. There was no breeze, no movement, only the weight of trees standing shoulder to shoulder like silent witnesses. It was then, in that trembling pause before dawn, that I felt it. A pressure, subtle but undeniable, prickled across the back of my neck. The unmistakable awareness of being seen. My eyes traveled the dark wall of trees to the east, where the first suggestion of light painted their crowns with a faint silver. Beyond the trunks, nothing shifted, nothing moved, yet the sensation tightened, threading itself through my chest like a slow constriction. I told myself it was instinct, some primitive echo warning me of hidden predators. But instinct usually carries sound, snapping twigs, rustling undergrowth, the shuffle of something alive. This was different. This felt patient, watching. The Treeline stood like a black horizon. Branches overlapped in jagged silhouettes, their tips trembling slightly as if from an invisible breath. Between those shapes, gaps of darkness opened like unblinking eyes. My own eyes strained against the gloom, and for a fleeting heartbeat I thought I saw a glint, a reflection, two pale points of light, small but unmistakable, hovering at the edge where night still ruled. They vanished before my mind could settle on their shape, leaving only the trembling afterimage in my vision. The forest thickened with the faint glow of oncoming dawn, a gradual bleeding of color that made every shadow heavier. Mist coiled in slow spirals around the base of the pines, curling like smoke around an unseen fire. My breath joined it, soft clouds that rose and vanished almost immediately. I should have moved, turned back to the path that led to the cabin, but my feet anchored themselves to the damp ground. Something about the stillness demanded witness. A low creak echoed through the woods, the sound of old wood bending under weight. It came from the same direction as the faint glint I thought I'd seen. My pulse began to hammer, loud enough that I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I forced my eyes to focus on the Treeline, scanning each dark seam between trunks. The world seemed to sharpen, every droplet of dew catching the dim light like tiny mirrors, every ridge of bark etched in cold clarity. Then I saw them, not a trick of reflection, not the hesitant shimmer of retreating stars. Eyes. Several pairs, set low and far apart, glowing faintly like pale embers behind the veil of branches. They were motionless, fixed on me with the calm certainty of a predator that has already decided the outcome of the encounter. The forest around them remained unnervingly still. No crunch of leaves, no shifting weight, no breath to mark their presence. Only those faint orbs of light, steady and cold. My throat tightened, and I realized I had been holding my breath. When I finally exhaled, the sound felt deafening in the heavy air. I stepped back. The wet earth sucked lightly at my heel, releasing with a soft pop that seemed to echo far too loudly. The eyes did not flinch. If anything, they seemed to brighten, as though aware of my retreat. Another creak followed, closer this time, like the slow hinge of a door opening where no door existed. The rising sun began to smear faint streaks of gold across the upper branches, revealing more of the forest's interior. For an instant, I wished for full daylight, yet some primal part of me recoiled from the thought. Light would not dispel what waited there. Light might only reveal the shape of what I already feared. I turned slightly, enough to catch the path in the corner of my vision. The narrow trail looked impossibly thin, a fragile lifeline leading back towards safety. But the idea of moving, of turning my back on those watching eyes, felt like inviting something to follow. My muscles ached from the effort of stillness. A faint rustle broke the stalemate. Not the casual movement of an animal, but a slow, deliberate slide of something large brushing against wet undergrowth. The sound drew a line through the air, beginning deep within the trees and stopping just short of the clearing. The eyes remained fixed, their pale light steady, but now I sensed mass behind them, weight, presence, a density that pressed against the fabric of the morning. The scent of pine thickened suddenly, sharp and almost metallic, mixing with the earthy damp until it bordered on nausea. I swallowed hard and forced myself to breathe evenly. Each inhale carried the cold taste of soil. Each exhale clouded the air with fragile wisps that dissipated too quickly, as if something unseen devoured them. Time stretched into an endless loop of heartbeat and shallow breath. The sun inched higher, spilling thin shafts of amber between the trunks. Light touched the mist, turning it into a shifting lattice of gold and gray. The eyes faded slightly as the glow strengthened, but they did not vanish. They only retreated deeper, withdrawing just enough to keep their outlines blurred. At last, a single crow broke the silence with a jagged cry, a sound so harsh and sudden that it felt like the forest itself gasping awake. The spell fractured. My body jolted into motion before thought could interfere. I stepped back again, then again, my boots sliding against slick roots. The path waited, narrow and damp, its gravel slick with dew. I turned and began to move, forcing my legs into a steady rhythm. The woods around me remained silent except for the soft crunch of soil and the faint whisper of mist sliding past my coat. With each step, the sensation of being watched clung stubbornly to my back, a cold weight between my shoulder blades. I did not look over my shoulder. The forest thinned gradually, trees giving way to open ground. The cabin's roofline appeared through the fading fog, dark against the brightening sky. Only then did I allow myself a final glance. The Treeline stood quiet and ordinary, bathed now in the pale wash of sunrise. No eyes, no shapes, only branches heavy with dew. Yet the air still carried that subtle pressure, the weight of something unseen holding its breath just beyond the edge of morning. I stepped inside the cabin and closed the door, the soft click of the latch swallowed by the empty rooms. Even as I leaned against the wooden frame, breathing hard, I knew the forest had not forgotten me. Something had watched from the Treeline as the sun began to rise, and though the daylight now painted everything harmless, I could feel those eyes lingering in the corners of memory, patient, unblinking, waiting for the night to return. There are moments when the world feels like it has been drained of warmth, when the air itself seems to recoil from the touch of life. That night was one of those moments. The forest behind my uncle's cabin had always held a quiet tension, a hush that clung to the trees no matter the season, but in the brittle heart of winter it felt sharper, colder, like something was holding its breath, waiting. I should never have gone out there alone, but the lure of the clearing at first frost had always been stronger than my common sense. The night had been still when I left the cabin, the kind of stillness that swallows sound before it can echo. Each step across the wooden porch groaned beneath my boots, a fragile complaint that felt louder than it should have. My breath left me in soft clouds, curling into the moonlight that hung low and heavy above the treetops. The moon was nearly full, washed in a pale haze that bled into the frozen branches, painting them with a glow that made the forest look more like a dream than a place that should be walked by anyone with a sense of self-preservation. The path to the clearing was narrow and old, carved decades ago by hunters whose names had long since been forgotten. Frost clung to every twig, every blade of dead grass, sparkling faintly when my flashlight beam slid across them. The smell of pine was sharp and dry, threaded with the metallic bite of cold earth. Beneath it all, though, there was something else, something faint but unmistakable, like wet stone and iron. A smell that didn't belong to the forest. My boots crunched over the thin crust of ice that coated the soil. Each sound carried farther than expected, bouncing off the trunks and vanishing into the blackness beyond. I felt exposed, as if the trees themselves were leaning in to watch me. The deeper I walked, the heavier the air seemed to grow. It wasn't just cold, it was thick like breathing through damp cloth. The flashlight flickered once, a nervous stutter of yellow light, and for an instant I thought I heard movement behind me. A faint shuffle like bare feet dragging over frozen ground. I turned. Only trees. Dark, skeletal pines reaching upward, their branches clattering softly in a breeze I couldn't feel. The sound might have been nothing more than settling ice, but it slid through me like a needle of ice. I swallowed and kept moving. The clearing revealed itself gradually. The path opened like a wound in the woods, an oval of pale grass and brittle weeds coated in a delicate frosting of ice crystals. Moonlight pooled across it, silvery and sharp, so bright it seemed to hum against my eyes. The air here smelled different. Cleaner but colder and tinged with something faintly sweet, like the sterile sweetness of snow just before it melts. I stepped forward, boots sinking slightly into the hardened earth. That's when I saw her. At first she was only a shape, a smear of white against the dark fringe of trees on the far side of the clearing. I thought for a heartbeat that it was fog curling low to the ground, a trick of the moonlight. But then the shape moved, slowly, deliberately, and it was not fog, a woman, or something shaped like one. Her skin was nearly the color of the frost, a pallor that seemed to catch and hold the moonlight until it glowed faintly. Her hair was long and tangled, hanging around her shoulders like strands of shadowless smoke. And she was barefoot. I could see her feet pressing against the frozen grass, leaving no indentations, no disturbance of the brittle crystals. She moved with a grace that was both languid and unnatural, each step silent, as if she were gliding rather than walking. I froze where I stood, every muscle in my body locked. My breath rasped inside my throat, loud in the silence. She was far away, across the clearing, but even from that distance, I could see the unnatural smoothness of her skin. There was no reflection in her eyes. In fact, I couldn't even find her eyes at first. Only the suggestion of them, dark hollows that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. She walked with no hesitation, no awareness of the cold that burned through my own layers of clothing. Bare feet, pale legs, the hem of a thin white dress brushing against the icy grass without a sound. I wanted to move. I wanted to run. But my body felt disconnected from my mind, heavy and useless. My heart beat, so hard I thought it might crack the ice in my veins. She stopped halfway across the clearing. The suddenness of her stillness was worse than her movement. One heartbeat she was gliding forward, the next she was a statue carved of moonlight and bone. Her head tilted slightly, like a curious bird. The hollows where her eyes should have been seemed to deepen. I could feel her attention settle on me, a pressure in the air that tightened the skin across my arms and face. It was like standing beneath a thunderhead moments before the strike. The smell of iron grew stronger, coating the back of my tongue with a metallic tang. My flashlight sputtered again and died completely, leaving only the silver wash of moonlight. I couldn't look away. My breath came in short, painful bursts, frosting the air in quick clouds that seemed too loud in the silence. Then movement. Not hers. Something behind me. A soft crunch of frost, deliberate and slow. The sound of weight settling on frozen earth. I wanted to turn, but the woman's presence held me in place. My eyes darted toward the tree line to my left, catching nothing but black trunks and pale ice. Another crunch. Closer. The woman tilted her head further, an angle that went just a fraction too far to be human. Her mouth moved. Not a smile, not a frown, just the barest twitch of lips, as if shaping a word that no sound carried. My ears rang with the absence of noise. Even my heartbeat seemed to have slowed to a cold, steady thud. The crunching behind me stopped. The air shifted, a subtle change like the pulling back of a curtain. I felt it against my skin, a brush of warmth that vanished as quickly as it came. The woman raised one foot, her toes hovering above the frost, and took another silent step forward, and another. Each movement was excruciatingly slow, deliberate, as though savoring the distance between us. My legs finally obeyed. I stumbled backward, boots sliding over the slick ground. The sound of my retreat broke the spell for a moment. Her head jerked in a motion too sharp, too sudden, like a puppet's string being yanked. I turned and ran. The forest swallowed me in an instant. Branches clawed at my jacket, snapping against my face, leaving cold scratches that burned. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel her behind me, feel the air bending around her, the silence chasing me like a shadow. My breath tore at my throat, each inhale tasting of iron and pine. The path seemed longer than before, twisting where it should have been straight, doubling back on itself like a nightmare. When I finally broke through the Treeline and onto the cabin's porch, I slammed the door behind me with a force that rattled the frame. The silence on the other side was immediate. No footsteps followed, no whisper of movement, only the distant creak of the trees. Hours later, when the pale edge of morning finally began to bleed across the horizon, I forced myself to look out the frost-coated window. The clearing was visible through the thinning trees, silvered by dawn. It looked empty, perfectly still, but the frost where I had stood was gone, melted into a dark, damp patch of earth. And across the clearing, faint and delicate as a spider's thread, were the shapes of footprints. Bare, human, leading from the Treeline to the center of the clearing. They stopped there. They never turned back. The woods behind my cousin's cabin were never silent. Even in the dead of winter, when frost coated every brittle branch and the lake beyond the tree line turned to stone, something always moved. Tiny paws scrabbled under the leaves, an owl's low call rolled through the canopy, wind worried the tops of the pines. That night, though, the forest had folded in on itself and gone still, like a room where someone had been breathing only moments ago, but now held their breath. I left the cabin long after midnight, restless from the kind of unease that feels too thin to name. The others were asleep inside, floorboards creaking under the slow rhythm of their breaths, while I stepped into air that smelled of frozen earth and iron. My boots sank into a crust of icy needles. The ground radiated a damp cold that worked its way through the soles and up my legs until my knees felt hollow. The moon was only a sliver, its light weak and metallic, enough to silver the edges of trunks and turn every branch into the outline of something waiting. I carried no flashlight. I wanted darkness, wanted to feel the raw texture of the forest without the comfort of a beam cutting it open. The trail curved ahead like a ribbon of shadow. I followed it because I had nowhere else to go, because something in that stillness invited me deeper. The smell of sap and old bark sharpened as I descended the slope toward the creek. A thin film of ice stretched across the water, catching the moonlight in jagged shapes. I crouched, touched the surface with a fingertip, and felt the fragile skin of winter break and slide beneath my nail. The sound of cracking ice was the only thing alive. It echoed far beyond its size, bouncing between trunks as though the forest had been waiting for a cue. That was when I saw it. At first it was only the impression of movement, a shift in the black on black between two pines across the creek. The trees were spaced evenly, their trunks pale as bone. Between them, something darker than shadow slid along the ground and then stopped. I blinked hard, blaming the moon's trick of depth, but the shape remained, a sliver of black that didn't belong to trunk or branch. It leaned, almost imperceptibly as if listening. I stayed crouched, heart pushing against my ribs with a slow, deliberate pressure. No crunch of leaves, no snap of twigs. Just that shape, a negative space where even moonlight refused to fall. I told myself it was nothing, a deer perhaps, though deer carried a scent of warm fur and broken moss. The air around me smelled only of frost and stone. The shadow tilted. It was a motion so slight I might have dismissed it if the rest of the forest weren't locked in perfect stillness. Trees do not tilt against the wind when the wind is gone. This thing shifted like a body reconsidering its stance. I felt the urge to stand, to back away, but my muscles tightened into the frozen earth. I watched instead. Then it moved. Not a step, not a glide. A rearrangement. One moment it occupied the narrow gap between the pines, the next it elongated, stretching sideways as if uncoiling. There was no sound, no disturbance of the brittle undergrowth, only the sensation of distance collapsing, like the space between us had grown thinner, without either of us crossing it. The moon slipped behind a cloud, and the forest drowned in black. For a heartbeat I saw nothing, only the red pulse of blood behind my eyelids. When the moonlight returned, the gap between the pines was empty. I exhaled, not realizing until then that I'd been holding the breath in my chest. My knees ached from crouching. I forced myself upright, every movement loud in the hush. Ice cracked beneath my boots, each step a gunshot. I turned back toward the trail, the cabin a distant smear of warm color through the trees. Halfway up the slope, a branch snapped behind me. The sound was wrong, too deliberate, too heavy for a falling limb. It carried a weight that suggested intention. I didn't turn. My body understood before my mind could. Whatever had been a shadow now existed in the same world as my heartbeat. The trail narrowed between two boulders slick with moss. My shoulder brushed cold stone as I passed through, and for an instant I smelled something sharp and metallic, like wet iron. The forest ahead blurred, depth collapsing into a flat wash of gray. My breath came fast, clouding in short bursts that hung in the air before vanishing. Another sound followed, the faint drag of something across frozen needles. Not footsteps, a glide, a slow, measured sweep like fabric pulled across sandpaper. I quickened my pace, boots sliding on patches of frost. The cabin lights were still distant, faint golden squares suspended in the black. I thought of shouting, names of the people inside, anything but the forest swallowed even the idea. My voice felt trapped behind my teeth. Instead I listened, each step matched by a softer echo behind me. Not quite in rhythm, just off enough to remind me that the echo belonged to something alive. When the path curved toward a clearing, I risked a glance over my shoulder. At first there was only darkness. Then, along the line where the trees met the night sky, something detached itself from the black and leaned forward. A silhouette without edges, a figure carved from absence. No shine of eyes, no hint of limb, only the undeniable sense of a presence that noticed me. It did not hurry. I stumbled into the clearing, boots sinking into a thin crust of snow. The open space offered no comfort. Moonlight spilled across the frost, revealing the delicate network of animal tracks frozen mid-journey. Every mark pointed outward, away from the center, as if the wildlife refused to cross this patch of earth. The dragging sound stopped. Silence pressed against my ears until it became a tone, a low humming that lived inside my skull. I scanned the tree line, every trunk a perfect soldier, every shadow an invitation. Nothing moved. And then, in the far corner of the clearing, darkness shifted against darkness. It stood just beyond the reach of moonlight, taller than the surrounding pines, its outline wrong in a way my mind refused to arrange into a shape. The air around it shimmered faintly, as if heat rose from the frozen ground. I felt the pressure of its attention, a cold weight settling on my shoulders. I stepped backward. The figure didn't follow. Instead, the ground beneath it seemed to absorb light, a slow swallowing of silver into black. The trees behind it bent slightly inward, as if leaning to listen. My throat tightened. The metallic scent grew stronger, like blood cooling on iron. One more step back. Another. The figure remained, patient and unhurried. I reached the edge of the clearing where the trail dipped toward the cabin. A gust of wind finally returned, sharp and sudden, rattling the frozen branches. When the leaves settled, the figure was gone. The rest of the walk blurred into fragments. The crunch of frost under frantic feet, the sharp taste of air that cut the back of my throat, the faint yellow glow of the cabin swelling between the trees. By the time I reached the porch, my fingers were numb, my chest aching from a run I barely remembered starting. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and sleep. The others still breathed in slow, dream-heavy rhythms. No one had stirred. I locked the door, slid the deadbolt home, and pressed my back against the wall. Outside, the forest had resumed its ordinary sounds, branches creaking, a distant owl calling. Life pretending it had never paused. But through the crack between the curtains, the clearing was still visible, washed in pale moonlight. For a moment I thought I saw the faintest ripple at the far edge, a sliver of shadow stretching just a fraction too far. Then the cloud cover thickened, and everything beyond the glass sank into perfect, impenetrable black. I stayed awake until dawn, listening to the woods breathe, waiting for the sound of something that might never have left. I woke before the sky had even begun to gray, long before the faintest hint of morning touched the trees outside. It was the kind of dark that feels more like a substance than an absence, a thick, weightless black that seemed to cling to the walls of my room and press gently against my eyelids even when they were open. The air carried that peculiar stillness that comes right before dawn, when the world seems to hesitate between night and day. Not even the crickets were chirping, no rustle of wind, just a vast, heavy silence. I lay there for a long time, not moving, listening to the sound of my own breathing. The house around me felt unusually hollow, as if the wooden beams and plaster had absorbed every scrap of sound. The air smelled faintly of damp wood, an old earth scent creeping in through the cracks of the window frame. My blanket was warm against my skin, but there was a faint, inexplicable chill on my face, like the air itself was slowly exhaling against me. That was when I heard it, a whisper. It wasn't the kind of sound you'd mistake for something else. Not the creak of settling wood, not the shifting sigh of pipes or the breath of a draft. It was a voice, low, deliberate, carried on the stillness like smoke. My name, drawn out softly, almost lovingly, yet wrong in a way that made my stomach twist. It came from just beyond the window. Every muscle in my body locked tight. I didn't sit up, didn't move, didn't even breathe for a heartbeat. The sound had been close, closer than any passing animal or wandering stranger should have been at that hour. My bedroom window faced the side yard, where the grass sloped into a narrow tree line no more than 15 feet away. Beyond that lay a stretch of dark woods that had been there long before the house was built. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. Maybe it was the half-dreaming mind, caught between sleep and wakefulness, generating phantom noises. But before the thought could settle, the whisper came again. My name, clearer this time, drawn like a thread through the black. It slid through the screen of the window, carried on air that suddenly felt too cold for late summer. My heart hammered in my chest, loud enough that I was certain whoever, or whatever, was outside could hear it. The sound of it filled my ears until it became a dull, frantic roar. I forced myself to move, inching toward the edge of the bed as silently as I could. The floorboards were cool against my feet, smooth and faintly gritty with dust. I crouched low and crept toward the window. The curtains hung heavy and unmoving. A faint metallic tang reached my nose, like wet iron or cold stone. My fingertips hovered over the edge of the fabric, trembling. The whisper came again, my name, stretched and hollow, like air escaping a cracked pipe. Only this time, it was followed by the faintest scrape. A soft, deliberate drag of something along the wood siding of the house. I pulled the curtain back an inch. Nothing. Just the yard, swallowed in absolute black. No moon. No stars. The trees stood as silhouettes against a void so deep it felt like a second sky. The window glass reflected the faint shape of my face, eyes wide and pale in the darkness. For a moment I thought I saw something shift, a deeper shadow folding into itself near the tree line. But the night swallowed it whole before I could be certain. Then came the sound of breath. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even sharp. It was simply there, slow, steady, almost curious. Like someone standing just beneath the sill, exhaling into the quiet. The whisper followed, softer now but unmistakable. My name again, drawn out until the last syllable frayed into nothing. A damp chill slid down my spine. I backed away from the window, careful not to make the floorboards creak. My mind scrambled for explanations. A neighbor wandering too close, a prank, the wind funneling through some hidden gap. But the woods beyond my yard were private, and the nearest house sat half a mile down the road. No one should have been there, and the air was perfectly still. I wanted to turn on the light, but some instinct warned against it. I couldn't explain why, but I knew with a cold certainty, that breaking the darkness would be like drawing a beacon to myself. So I stayed in the half-shadow, crouched beside the bed, listening. The whisper came again, louder, closer. It felt as though it was inside the room now, seeping through the thin layer of glass and wood. My name slid through the air with a wet softness, like leaves dragging through water. I could almost feel it against my ear, a vibration more than a sound. My mouth went dry. I pressed a hand against the floor to steady myself and felt the faint tremor of something, a vibration, almost imperceptible, running through the boards. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the whisper stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. It stretched out, thick and endless, until my thoughts began to unravel. My heartbeat slowed to a painful crawl. I strained to hear anything, a branch cracking, the crunch of leaves, the distant hum of early morning traffic. But there was nothing. No insects, no wind, not even the faint hum of electricity from the clock on my nightstand. I don't know how long I stayed there. It could have been seconds. It could have been an hour. Time seemed to fold in on itself. The air grew heavier, damp with the smell of earth and something faintly metallic. My ears rang in the oppressive quiet. Then, somewhere deep within the trees, a bird chirped. It was a small sound, thin and uncertain, but it sliced through the silence like a blade. Another followed, then another, until the forest began to stir with the first tentative notes of dawn. The black outside my window softened into the faintest shade of gray. The spell, whatever it had been, began to break. Only then did I realize I was shaking. I stayed awake until the sun had fully risen, the room slowly brightening around me. The curtains glowed with pale morning light. The walls seemed less menacing, the floor less cold. But the memory of that voice clung to me like damp fabric. When I finally forced myself to look outside again, the yard appeared perfectly normal. The grass glittered with dew. The trees stood quiet and still. There were no footprints, no signs of disturbance. Only the faint scent of damp earth lingered in the air. I told myself it was a dream, a trick of the half-awake mind. But even now, days later, I can still hear the way my name slid through the dark, soft, careful, and unmistakably human. And every morning, just before the birds begin to sing, I wake without meaning to. The air is always heavy, the silence always thick, and I listen, because somewhere in that silence, I am certain someone is waiting. Someone who knows my name, someone who whispered it once, and is patient enough to whisper it again.